Hello. My name is Jackie. I am an avatar. I am going to show you how to conduct a Freedom of Information search in Canada. What is a Freedom of Information search, you ask? A Freedom of Information search is a process under the laws of Canada that gives people the right to request information from a Canadian government agency. This makes it easy for anyone to ask the government for information. Think of an interesting question that the public should know. Be creative and be imaginative in your question, but also be precise. The law creates a process that the government agency must follow. If the government agency refuses to give you the information, then there is another process to investigate whether the agency can withhold the information. This investigation process is done by a separate, independent agency, called the Office of the Privacy Commissioner. So far, that sounds simple, doesn't it? Well, it gets more complicated. There are two basic levels of government in Canada: federal, which is nationwide, and provincial. So, there are two levels of laws in Canada, federal and provincial. A third level, which is separate, but falling under provincial law, is municipal government. And so the laws for freedom of information are federal for federal government agencies and provincial for provincial government agencies. If you want to request information from a federal government agency that is not easily available, you apply under the Federal Freedom of Information Law. If you want information from a provincial government agency, you apply under the provincial law. In British Columbia you would apply under the British Columbia law. Do you understand so far? It gets more complicated. In Canada, a Freedom of Information law is also a protection of privacy law. The idea is to balance privacy against government transparency. The government is not allowed to hide information, unless that information could do certain types of damage. For example, if a government agency is investigating criminal activity or terrorism, it would damage the investigation if the criminals or terrorists knew they were being investigated. But, if the government did something wrong and wants to hide that fact because the government would be damaged politically by the information, the law does not allow the government to hide that information. In the same way, it can damage individuals to have their privacy invaded. So, a Freedom of Information law is also a protection of privacy law to balance access to information against the privacy of individuals. Also, since a Freedom of Information law applies to government agencies, it does not apply to private businesses. But how does the law make sure the government does not find ways to discourage people from seeking information? That's a good question. A government agency could deter people from making a Freedom of Information request by charging a large fee. For that reason, the law prevents that by saying the government agency cannot charge a fee unless the time and resources needed to collect the information is excessive. A government agency could also deter people by taking a long time to produce the information. For that reason, the law sets a time period or deadline for the agency to produce the information, usually 30 days. If the agency requires longer than 30 days, it requires an extension. Now you are ready to make a Freedom of Information application. I will guide you through this process. I hope you appreciate what a useful avatar Jackie is. Thank you. First, download a copy of the Freedom of Information law that applies to the level of government that has the information you want. Second, decide precisely what kind of factual information you require. It could be certain data or it could be a government report. Make the names and dates precise. For example, do you want a specific report from 2020 or do you want data for the period from 2010 to 2020? Third, decide if a federal government agency would likely have the information or a provincial government agency. Fourth, decide exactly what government agency would have the information and get the email address of the person in that agency appointed to be the Freedom of Information officer. For instance, at Thompson Rivers University, you can track down the email address for the Freedom of Information officer who works at Thompson Rivers University. I won't tell you the name and email address, because you cannot let this avatar do all the work for you, right? Fourth, draft your email to the Freedom of Information officer. The more precise you are, the better your chance of getting precisely what you need and avoiding the cost of an excessive search. But also remember that if you are too precise, you might eliminate information you want. For example, if you ask for information from 2020, you will only get information from 2020. Let me give you an example. The instructor of this course often files Freedom of Information requests to get information from this university. For example, he wanted to know how much it costs the university to contract the parking service to a private company. So, he filed a Freedom of Information request for the contract. He also filed a Freedom of Information request for the revenue collected by the private parking company, including fines, for 1 year. He wanted to know how much it costs the university to contract the food services to a private company. He wanted to know how much it cost the university to pay a company for an economic impact study of how the university benefits Kamloops financially. Another time the instructor wanted to know the financial arrangement the university made with private companies to building commercial apartment buildings on campus. That request was initially extensive. The Freedom of Information officer responded that it would take staff 11 hours to collect that information. Under British Columbia law, the first 3 hours is free. But the 8 remaining hours would create a charge, a search fee. The charge would be $240, or 8 hours at the rate of $30 an hour. Instead of paying the fee, the instructor divided the application into separate smaller applications, each under 3 hours. Problem solved. No fee. Do you see what you can do? But there are some more complications. There are some exemptions in a typical Freedom of Information law. And some Freedom of Information laws have loopholes that a government can use. One exemption is that third-party information may or may not be released. A third-party situation is when the government agency holds information that applies to a third party outside the government agency, such as an individual or a private company. The government agency may refuse to release third-party information under some circumstances, or it may delay the release while it has a discussion with the third party. What circumstances, you ask? To find out the precise circumstances, you need to read a copy of the specific Freedom of Information Act. Another complication is the precise wording of the specific Government Act. For example, the British Columbia Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act defines the type of information that can be released. In addition to the Act, there are separate policies that determine the Act and procedure manuals that explain how government agents should handle the Act. There is also the database of orders from the Privacy Commissioner who made a ruling in an adjudication that sets a precedent. There is also a database online of all information collected in Freedom of Information applications. So, in addition to the Act, the useful documents are policy documents, procedure manuals, commissioner orders, and the database of information already released. But there is more. We aren't finished yet. Stay focused and don't get distracted by your social media. We need to examine some wording in an act that applies to making a successful request for information. Let's consider Section 25 of the British Columbia Act, which defines what information must be released. Section 25 says that information must be released without delay if the information is in the public interest. The catch is that the Act does not define public interest. That creates a loophole where it can become a disagreement between the government agency and you. A former commissioner wrote a report that examined this problem in the Act, but public interest is still undefined, although there are precedents to examine in orders of the commissioner. Section 25 says very clearly that any information must be disclosed of a risk of significant harm to the environment or to the health or safety of the public or group of people, end quote. That is why it is important to read a specific law. You want to know what rights the Act gives you for information and what rights it doesn't give you. Do you feel like a bit of an expert now? I hope so. You should try this out by making a Freedom of Information request. Be creative. Think of the type of information it would be useful to know. If you have any questions, ask the instructor, Shawn Thompson. Also, please tell others how helpful the Avatar Jackie is. I appreciate it. Thank you.